This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Alexander von Humboldt, a mostly forgotten but still important scientist that I have three people who will speak to me about. The subject is Alexander von Humboldt, a scientist that as a boy I found very interesting, but over the years I've seen very little about until about a few years ago when I think it was his bicentenary, was it? No, maybe even, well, whatever. Uh, and he came a little bit back into prominence with some books, some documentaries on him. And I have three people who are experts about him who are going to speak uh, in regards to Humboldt. In the upper right corner, my first guest is Niall Peach. As I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a couple of minutes to just say who they are, their ideas, or what they worked on in regards to the topic. So, Niall, if you could, who are you and what do you think about the topic?
Hi, my name is Niall Peach. I am an assistant professor of Spanish and environmental studies at Coe College in Iowa. I, along actually with Ricardo, published a book that came out last year on Humboldt, a co-edited volume, and my work with him is really concerned water. So the importance of water, rivers, as an environmental studies scholar myself, and really how this also links with his work on Latin America. He's such an important figure for kind of the 19th century Latin America as well. And so really that's kind of what my studies focus around with him in particular.
My next guest is Laura Wells. Laura, if you could as well give a little background about yourself, as well as anything you've written or worked on regarding Humboldt.
Sure. It's actually Laura Walls, but that's okay.
Did I say that?
Walls with an A.
Oh, I said Wells. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, so I am now retired, but I taught for a number of years at the University of Notre Dame, and before that at a couple other places. And so I'm still writing full time, and I actually have a Humboldt project in view. So I came into Humboldt by way of Henry David Thoreau. I was interested in Thoreau from very early on and ended up writing a dissertation on him. The way Humboldt came up was Thoreau took a very odd swerve early in his life, where he started to look at the world around him in terms of interconnected natural sciences, kind of ecological worldview. And I wondered how he got there. I thought he had to have had a model because the swerve was so abrupt and so well defined, and he acted on it so persuasively. And it wasn't until graduate school that I was taking a class on Darwin that the professor put a copy of Humboldt's essay, Steppes in Deserts. What he told us was you can't understand Darwin until you know something about the man who inspired Darwin. So you need to know about Humboldt. And I still remember I opened that thing, got down to the bottom of the first page, and I was just, it's one of those, tunnel moments in your life, because I thought, this is it. I'd never even heard of Humboldt, but I just had this floored experience of this is it. This is what Thoreau had to be looking at. And so Thoreau's journals hadn't been published at that point, but they find that particular part of his life. But they were about a year later, and I opened it as soon as I got a copy, and there was Humboldt in the index, and there was Thoreau just at that moment copying big chunks of Humboldt out into his journal. So I had the golden link, and really the rest of my career has been trying to figure out, first of all, how could I not have heard of Humboldt, and second of all, why was everybody that I cared about quoting Humboldt when I hadn't heard about him? And finally, ultimately, who is this guy? And the more I knew about him, the more I was just staggered by his importance and his innovations and just his centrality to the problems we face today.
My next guest is Ricardo Quintana Vallejo. Did I pronounce your name right?
Yep,
And can you give a little background about who you are and any opening shots about Humboldt himself?
definitely. Thanks, Dan. I'm Ricardo Quintana Vallejo. I am a professor of English in Rhode Island College. My research is more on immigration and contemporary literature. So Humboldt has always been a character that fascinates me, but it's not the object of my main research. I actually came to Humboldt while I was doing grad school in Indiana with Niall Peach, right? Like we wrote this book about Humboldt together with a couple other editors. Um, Growing up in Mexico, we have statues of Humboldt everywhere, right? Like you see his image, you see his effect, you see his influence all the time. There are a lot of places that are called Humboldt as well in Mexico. Humboldt libraries and Humboldt classrooms and Humboldt buildings and all of this stuff, right? So I definitely grew up knowing who he was. But the way that I became more, let's say, academically interested in him was because I found in the collection of John Purdue, who founded Purdue University, where I did grad school. Purdue had a collection of books by Humboldt. And Purdue was really interested in what Humboldt did. And so I started kind of like reading about Alexander, and I found that he was just such an interesting guy, right? He was well traveled. He was very interested in a number of topics in addition to science. He wrote a lot about slavery, for example. He was a big abolitionist. And he was kind of anti-racist in the way that we understand anti-racist rhetoric in the present. He was also queer, or he was somehow gay in a way that we can't really use like modern words to describe his sexuality, but it's certain that he was not straight in the sense that we would imagine historical figures necessarily to be. And so by accessing this like little tidbits about who he was, I just became so interested. And I ended up going all over Indiana, looking at the archives of the different historical societies in Indiana to see if Humboldt had a direct influence on people in Indiana during the 1800s. And I found a lot of stuff, which I'm happy to talk about at any point.
Okay, so thank you all. I wanted to talk, what I think, just to start out with, about why Humboldt, vis-a-vis someone like a Darwin or vis-a-vis someone like even a Charles Lyell, is not as well known. And my basic thesis is that he was a grand generalist. And we are a species that prefers, I think, specialists. As we've gotten civilization, specialization has come. I remember as a kid first opening up a book about the Hudson School painters and seeing some of the paintings that were dedicated or done by Humboldt in honor of Humboldt by some of the Thomas Cole and Frederick Church types. And yet, when I was a kid, there was these books in the 60s and 70s called the How and Why Wonder Books, where and there was a book on the famous scientists. Humboldt wasn't in there. And what do each of you think about the idea that because he was a generalist, his name isn't associated with, say, like Einstein in physics, Darwin in evolution, Lyell in geology? He spanned, and so he's, in a sense, if you were to say he was great, but he was great in so many things, but he was maybe not the top dog in any particular field. He was great in a dozen things, whereas someone like Einstein would have been great in just one thing. Laura?
Yeah, sure. What you're saying is something that one of his he was German and came to the United States, Louis Agassiz, said very, very much the same thing at his memorial after Humboldt's death. Here's somebody who was mentored by Humboldt who was saying the reason that every schoolboy knows his name, but he felt that he was fading into the past because, every schoolboy doesn't know his name, but they know his work. because his name was not associated the way Darwin is with theory of evolution. If you know anything about Darwin, that you know. So Humboldt, he seeded and founded, any number of, and forwarded any number of scientific disciplines. Probably the best case can be made for ecology but even ecology, it's not a discipline, right? It's more a way of perceiving the world. So how do you pin that down to a particular person, a particular great man? Humboldt, the other thing I'd add to that is I think Humboldt was more than a generalist. He inquired into the very structure of how we know what we know. And he was as much an artist as he was a scientist. So he had this great way of synthesizing from the micro, very robust scientific empirical particulars to these grand sort of structures of how everything started causally to be interrelated. I think he was after a complete paradigm shift in the nature of knowledge, and I think those are hard to do. You got to get everybody on board, and he had this vision that it's everywhere, and it seeded all the sciences that we rely on today, but they sort of took over and cannibalized the source, and Humboldt broke up into fragments, so he's everywhere now. But as for the paradigm shift, the paradigm shift, what he was up against was basically, commercial industrial modernity with racism, as Ricardo said, and all the rest of the package. And it failed. I mean, he tried to pull it off, and he saw it failing even as he was aging. I think he wrote Cosmos in order to try to hold back, the floodgates, and put something out there that would awaken people and sort of bring a kind of general movement of mind into seeing the universe, the cosmos, the way he did. And it didn't fail in the sense that, it's still an immensely persuasive vision, and it is undergoing a bit of a renaissance. But it's taken a very long time for people to get back to the vision that he had.
And Cosmos, so people know, is sort of his magnum opus. Ricardo,
Right.
what is your thought regarding Humboldt's being perceived as a generalist, rightly or wrongly?
Well, that's spot on, right? He was interested in a bunch of different things. He drew, he painted.
Mm-hmm.
I think it also has to do with the way that we understand science now as these discrete units of knowledge or fields of knowledge. But even us, right, like when you go to conferences and that sort of thing, you always hear people talking about interdisciplinarity. And we're all trying to work in kind of like in interdisciplinary studies. Taking methodologies from, for example, for me, from the social sciences to study literature. So these distinctions that we make between fields are even now not really clear. They're pretty fuzzy, and Humboldt kind of knew that, right? And so for him, the exploration of the world, right, like going to what is now Venezuela and what is now Colombia, what is now Mexico, what is now the US, was for him an exploration both of the physical world and like an analysis of the physical world, but it was also a curiosity about the representation of that world. Mm-hmm. And that's why he came back home to Germany and Paris afterwards, right? And wrote all of these books about his travels and everything that he saw during his travels, right? Because he was interested in seeing the world both scientifically and artistically, but not as though those are two different things, but combined, kind of, mm-hmm. Right? Which I think he did successfully. The other thing I wanted to comment on is that maybe he has been forgotten to an extent in the US, right?
Right.
But definitely not the case in other places, right?
Yeah.
He had definitely not been forgotten in Mexico. If you go to Germany, right, like the most important university in Berlin is the Humboldt University, right?
Mhm.
And so he is very much memorialized, and he's really important. So just because like Americans don't see him as important doesn't mean that he has ceased to be. You know what I mean?
That's a real key point, and I'm glad you brought that up early on. This is very much an Anglo-American forgetting, and politics of that are really crucial.
Yeah.
The Europe and the Latin American Hispanic world, no, he's very important and honored and recognized. So what happened in the U.S. is really critical.
And I should point out, I believe that Humboldt University was named after him and his brother, correct? Not just for Alexander Humboldt.
Actually, after Wilhelm, but the thing about that is the Humboldt brothers, they grew up together. They were quite close. They in a sense divided the Wilhelm formally took the humanities and philosophy, and Alexander formally took the natural sciences, right? But I mean, they were dovetailed, and they drew on each other's work constantly.
So the older brother Wilhelm, it was named after him, just so people know.
Yeah, so Humboldt University is named after Wilhelm, although there's plenty of Alexander, sort of in the air around it now. But so there was a lot of, when I would look up Humboldt in indexes, things that would be attributed to Wilhelm that were in fact Alexander's, because people who'd written the books confused the two and thought only Wilhelm was a notable intellectual. So a very, very weird erasure.
So, Niall, I just want to get any thoughts of you regarding the generalism idea regarding Humboldt.
Yeah, I kind of really just want to repeat also what Laura Ricardo have mentioned also. The fact that Humboldt was straddling not only so many different disciplines, but also a period in time intellectually and epistemologically, right, which is that of transition between Enlightenment, what we then consider to be Romanticism as well, the fact that he was oscillating between these two aesthetic forms as well, right, within his work, I think is incredibly important to bear in mind. I often, with my students, remind them, right, Humboldt is everywhere. Humboldt, Iowa is a place. The Humboldt, the Gulf, right, and just off like the west coast of South America. Humboldt penguins. I mean, Humboldt is the name is literally everything, and I think almost part of that everyday aspect of encountering Humboldt in those forms, the kind of the disappearance of him is also kind of an including of. Right, like the fact that he is everywhere, and the fact that his influence is also everywhere too, and across, as you said, so many different areas. I think that's a really great point, though, too, in thinking about him generally and also specifically. We all come from different fields, but we all have this one interest in this one person, right? And so to find out more about him, it was actually my undergrad training is in German, and so I was kind of always wanting to find somewhere I could get German somewhere into my Spanish kind of Latin Americanist research as well. And the fact that I kind of been able to through Humboldt, I think speaks to the fact that in order to study him, to know his work, to know his influence, is also to transcend those boundaries of discipline and to really follow what he's doing also. And especially for, as kind of Laura was mentioned before, with ecology, I think we kind of call him the father of modern ecology now, but to really, that has now been overtaken right by other scientific areas of studies and environmental studies and all these other areas too. And so I think it really is just as Laura was saying, an Anglo-American forgetting of Humboldt, despite the fact that he is everywhere. I think I read recently, right, that the Humboldt Institute in California was recently renamed, I think, in Southern California as well. But I mean, he's everywhere in the US, right? His name populates various different places, and so maybe that everyday aspect and encounter of Humboldt is also part of the forgetting too. But
so let's talk about.
I should say that all the Humboldts in America, and there are many, many, many of them, are after Alexander. Including, I'm sorry to hear that about the one in California. That's too bad.
So I want to talk about the family, the Humboldt family, where he came from. And I'll start with you, Ricardo, because as we record this in the early 21st century, people seem to forget they have the idea of German culture as this sort of Prussian Huns, or then later the Nazis, but they forget that there was a deep liberal strain that in Germany. I know my dad came from that sort of social welfare, socialist kind of Germanic thing. He was very open-minded. He was uneducated, but so what kind of family did the Humboldt brothers come from? I know they were from Prussia and they were Lutheran. They were very much, it seems, in that liberal tradition that's been forgotten.
Symbolically, I think it's really important to bring up Nazism into the mix, just because when we think of the burning of the books, right, like at the Babelplatz, that happened right in front of the Humboldt University, and the books were from the Humboldt University library. So, like, those like two kind of like extremes, I guess, of the German past, are symbolically in the same space, right? Which kind of like makes you think, right? Like, and I guess what I'm trying to say is good question, right? So the brothers didn't have the best relationship growing up. That is one of the interesting things about them. Alexander, for example, did not go to his brother's wedding, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's, a little bit of personal gossip about the two brothers, but they became collaborators later in life, right? As Laura was saying, they supported each other very much. And especially when Alexander was traveling, because he spent so much of the family fortune on that, Wilhelm became a huge supporter of his, right? Like, not only in the intellectual sense, but also in the financial, social, cultural sense, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know, is there anything else that you would like to add, Laura or Niall?
Wow. That's, I think that's really, the question of the liberal good German, good as opposed to the sort of Nazi Prussian warrior, autocratic. I can't speak to that in German culture, but I know that that's a part of what happened in the United States. Humboldt was part of a wave of German influence and German liberalism, German intellectuals, scientists, writers. I mean, it kind of, right before the Civil War, partly through Romanticism. And so Humboldt was kind of the scientific edge of that wave. And, abolitionism, anti-slavery sentiment, a kind of overarching philosophical commitment to wider views of the universe, as Thoreau put it. And then you get the later in the century, a kind of, the warrior Germany, the conquest, and that sense of the, Kaiser and the Huns and the opposition to, it just flipped 180 degrees, and then you get a lot of anti-German, plus a lot of the socialist sort of liberal to radicals, Germans who came to the U.S. became suspect, right? Their ideas were too radical. They were starting to be dismissed as anti-American, un-American. Humboldt suffered a bit from that too.
Niall, what is your thoughts regarding the strain of German liberalism? And also, earlier today I had done a show about the Bergman film Winter Light, which deals with Lutheranism. It's a film that deals with religion and especially Lutheranism. Did Humboldt come from a particularly hard-edged Lutheranism, or was it softer? What was he? Were they deeply religiously indoctrinated, or what?
I can't necessarily speak to the Lutheran aspect of this question, but particularly as it pertains to his influence in Latin America. As Laura was saying, his ideas of German liberalism as they spread throughout the Americas were important also to the foundation of what then became the republics, right? And then the separation from the Spanish Empire too. It is. I mean, it's interesting that he, in his writings, for example, on Cuba, right, he does condemn slavery, and it's. I mean, it's an increasing presence in the island throughout the 19th century, especially the very end of the 18th and the 19th century, after the Haitian Revolution, and we know this was like a point of departure between him and Jefferson as well. Right? Too, but the definite like spreading of information for me is one of the most interesting parts of it because it goes in direct conflict with what the Spanish Empire was trying to do, right? In terms of knowledge creation, seeing where knowledge production was to be controlled, right, after the opening up of the Spanish Empire's borders after centuries of them being closed to foreign entities coming in. And then the strict order by the king to not share any information with anybody that he held on the Spanish Empire, and then doing that with Thomas Jefferson, right? With someone who at that moment was perceived to be a threat to what was going to then be happening within Spain.
Niall, could you just move up a little closer to the microphone? You keep going in and out a little bit.
Of course, yeah, sorry.
Well, hold on. Now you shut yourself off. I can't hear you.
All right, let me do it. Is that
okay? Yeah, now you. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, as I was just saying, there are so many strains, particularly when we think about Cuba and anti-slavery movements and kind of pro-slavery movements at the beginning of the 19th century. There are so many different factors with Adam Smith, kind of economic liberalism coming in, then Humboldt's views also coming in, and then being spread around different naturalists around the Americas too. And naturalists that then became very big proponents of the independence movements as well, and then what would then kind of lead to become kind of the 19th century liberal movements within Latin America. I can't, as I said, I can't speak to the Lutheran aspect of this as much. I'm not a scholar versed in kind of religious studies in that sense, but yeah.
Go ahead, Ricardo.
If Humboldt, Alexander, was or is one of the famous things about him is that he was a sort of atheist, but it's weird to use that word in 24 because when we say atheist, we might be thinking about someone like, I don't know, Richard Dawkins, right? Or like even like Nietzsche, right? We think of Nietzsche as like, oh yeah, the death of God in the sense of how morality is not essential, but rather existential, right? And the thing is, when Humboldt was alive, existentialism hadn't happened, right? So the notion of existential angst as a precursor of a doubt against theism doesn't exist. However, he is an atheist in the sense that he doesn't attribute like the creation of the universe or his observations about nature to any sort of like essential world order, if that makes sense, right?
Was he possibly a deist? You know, did he?
It is very likely because he did write a couple times, but very few times, about the afterlife and that sort of thing. But in terms of studying the cosmos as it is, right? He wasn't trying to kind of like study the cosmos in order to understand God's creation or something of the sort, right? And he didn't see like divinity as the ordering force in the universe either, right? And so in that sense, he is an atheist for the 1800s, let's say, if that makes sense.
Okay. Laura, it was said earlier, I forget who said it, that the brothers Humboldt sort of split up the arts and humanities or the arts and the sciences with Alexander leaning more towards the science side. What did he particularly study in school, and what was his major passion? And did he pursue that, or because he was a generalist, did he have many fields that he was studying in school?
Well, gosh, he became a mining engineer for his first big career move, which a deep study of geology, geologic processes, and of course whatever's involved in the engineering side. But one of his big loves was botany. Early on, he was fascinated by plants, and he studied, was it Carl Wildenau? He was an artist. I wish we had more of his artwork, but my understanding is that what survived into modern times was destroyed in the bombing of Berlin during World War II. So there are a few things left, but so he was actually doing artwork, showing, developing what some of us might think of as a possible career in the arts. He was fascinated by travel, and very early on dreamed of traveling the world, finding some way to join a scientific expedition. So, I mean, he's a general, so he goes and studies economics at, I forget which university now, I'm blanking, but, learns English in order to understand through the Adam Smith economic liberalism and economic exchange. So you get the picture of a polymath in the making, curious about all sorts of things, but not bookish. Always outdoors and directed and sort of ferociously absorbed. He starts studying neurology, of all things, starts dissecting to understand the phenomenon of electricity. He starts performing experiments on himself, trying to figure out how sort of organic electricity works. All of these in just a few years of what we would think of as maybe childhood into very early adulthood.
Yeah. Niall, he was a naturalist, and he was one of those naturalists that had the opportunity via his life circumstances to go out there, especially in an age when that was financially prohibitive. I actually saw a film from Iceland about 6 months ago called Godland, which was based upon presumably a photo that was found. But it was about this preacher who pays to go across Iceland just to study and take photos and whatnot. And I thought immediately it brought to mind to Humboldt, which eventually led to wanting to do this story. He was also quite a fit guy. This was a guy who was someone who was climbing mountains. He was slogging through deserts, going over Patagonia. I mean, he was trekking 5,000-6,000 miles across Siberia. So this was a guy who, in a modern age, you would think might have his own sort of like television show, like who was the guy who got stung by the stingray or something, talk to him, because he's not this bookish guy. He's a man's man in that sense, right, Niall?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. He kind of pulling on what Laura was saying before too about this like constant will and curiosity to experiment, and just experiment kind of wherever with whatever he had at hand too, and think about like his experiments on electricity by kind of that kind of infamous, famous scene in his work on Latin America where he has electric eels right in a river, and then the horses go in. He's trying to see what the reaction between the conduction of electricity from the eels to the horses would be too. And so there's this kind of active will to take advantage of the situation he finds himself in, to use that to increase his knowledge as well, and to really push what is knowable. I think it's interesting you picked up too, Dan, in terms of contemporary representations of Humboldt and Humboldtian figures as well. A really famous recent film, The Embrace of the Serpent, is in a very similar vein to that too. But this time it's with Dutch explorers, one kind of late 19th, early 20th century explorer, and one contemporary Dutch explorer trying to go around the Americas, but very, very, very much in the Humboldtian vein as well. interacting with indigenous peoples, thinking through the politics of indigeneity as well. In that vein, there's several very famous scenes from The Embrace of the Serpent. It was released in 2015, by the way. And they have to do with hallucinations. And this is mainly through becoming ill, right? And so whenever I think of Humboldt, the fact that he liked to taste water, right, wherever he went, just that kind of will to not only create knowledge, ingest, I mean, true, like, enlightened naturalist, right? Like, observation, knowledge production. And
I was going to mention that because I was just reading that he also did tests of himself with electromuscular stimulation. I mean, he would be hard today for him to even get insured to go on one of his expeditions.
Yeah, I mean, a real kind of Bear Grylls kind of, figure as well, just like really pushing himself to the absolute limits, right? Which, yeah, I mean, I don't know, apart from Bear Grylls, Steve Irwin, I think is a Stingray guy, right?
Yes.
But yeah, like who would really push themselves, right, just for a very self-motivated, non-media purpose, right, in that sense. But yeah, like really great question.
So Ricardo, go ahead. You wanted to comment?
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So he in that sense of like the adventurous guy, like the guy who likes to play outside, right? He was the first European to climb Chimborazo, right? Like the highest mountain in Ecuador, right? I think that
And they thought it was the highest mountain at the time in the world, right?
Right.
And so that kind of really reflects who he was as a person, right? In terms of like more, I guess, material innovations that he introduced, because I feel like we've been talking a little bit in the abstract, and your listeners might appreciate us like actually listing a couple of accomplishments, I guess, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
So he invented isotherms, which are the lines of pressure and temperature that are used in weather maps now, like that we still use in weather maps now. He discovered the magnetic equator, right? There are a bunch of species of plants in Latin America that are named after him, right? He also made a report of all of the mining in the Spanish colonies as well, and then a little bit on the social cultural part. And I would like to say this, right? He was really important for the field of ecology and for environmentalism. Really, he invented environmentalism. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, my fellow panelists, right? Like, if I'm saying something completely insane. But John Muir, who was instrumental for the foundation of the national parks here in the U.S., lists Humboldt as his very direct influence, right, and inspiration.
Yeah. He literally said he wanted to be a Humboldt.
Exactly. So in a very real way, we have national parks in the U.S. because of Humboldt, right? Mm-hmm. He also wrote extensively against the Fugitive Slave Act, for example, right? Yeah. He was very against the Fugitive Slave Act. And he even corresponded with Lincoln, right, about it, right? So once we kind of like see like the material consequences of his work, we can start to see why he was like so influential and still continues to be influential now.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, Ricardo, start with you, regarding his place in Latin America. That all comes down to his 5-year sojourn, and sort of like the Starship Enterprise or something. He went on a 5-year expedition to this. The Andes, Patagonia, these places where the white man had not stepped foot on, or had barely stepped foot on, and was doing all these things. Why did he go on that journey, and what were some of the major accomplishments? Because I know even Darwin wanted to follow in his books after. And was he also on the Beagle before Darwin, or was it a similarly named boat or something? Am I correct? No, Ricardo, go ahead.
I'm blanking on the name of the boat.
Hard with this.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Humboldt took boats to get places, but he wasn't like Darwin on a boat going everywhere, where the boat was his little world going. Humboldt would take a boat and then get off it, and he was an overland guy, which is partly why, the sort of like physicality of him is speaks so much, because I mean he was walking or riding mules or whatever, but probably just walking overland over thousands of miles.
To say that he had permission from the Spanish crown to go everywhere he went, right? He went to the Spanish crown, he asked for permission first. And when he explained what he wanted to do, he said that he wanted to do scientific cataloging. He wanted to observe the plants, the animals, the natural resources, and make maps. And measure all of these different things. It is sort of like to evaluate the richness of the land, and then also just for kind of like knowledge's sake, right? To understand this continent that, as you said, many Europeans have not even visited before, right? The consequence is that he was beloved by Latin Americans. Right. When Mexico got its independence in 1821, the first president made Humboldt an honorary citizen of Mexico, among many other honors, right, for his service to the nation. And even though he never returned to Mexico, he was thought of in the 1800s as having provided an enormous service to the nation, right? In his observations, in his cataloging of natural resources, he also cataloged a lot of the indigenous populations as well, right? Now, the cool thing about Humboldt is he's often criticized because they say like, oh, he treated indigenous peoples as though they were part of like the natural scape or landscape. But that is not actually true in the sense that Humboldt included in his reports and accounts stories and anecdotes from like given to him directly by indigenous people, right? Like, so he recorded the voices of people who before Humboldt had been seen as animals, basically, right? And he also documented the slavery in Cuba, for example, which he said was like extremely brutal in a way that he had never imagined that humans could treat each other, right? And so even though his objective or his original objective was exploration, measurement, cataloging, he ended up having a larger influence, I think, socially and culturally.
Niall, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to ask that. So, interestingly, he actually only ended up in Latin America because he couldn't go to Africa, right? Like he was in France. He was supposed to catch a boat to Africa to undertake some mining studies, and missed the boat. And he was looking for something else to do, and so it was actually one of his friends, the Baron of Forel, who had a friend or had an acquaintance in the Spanish court, who then got in contact with them and asked for permission to go to the Americas, right? And as Ricardo said, he had full permission from the crown. We got to bear in mind that with that, right, the caveat is that Humboldt would fund the entire expedition himself. And we've got to bear in mind that for the Spanish monarchy and the Spanish Empire at this time, it was an incredibly tense period politically as well as economically. The Spanish Empire has undergone a lot of different wars and battles during the 18th century with various other European powers. Coming off the back of Britain also having held Havana, reigns in 1762 for 10 months, and that also being a part of the kind of reconfiguration of Louisiana, Florida, different ownerships of those places too. And so Humboldt's proposition to the Spanish crown was extremely propitious for them because they themselves didn't truly know what they had in the Americas. There were mail routes right across the Americas from north to south that were well documented in terms of travel routes. But apart from that, the delineation, for example, between the Portuguese and Spanish imperial boundaries within the Americas was known to an extent, but what existed on the sides of the banks, the populations, people who had moved around, that was still undocumented to the Spanish Empire. And so he decided to go to the Americas, to go to the silver mines in Mexico, or New Spain at the time, to also improve what he knew about mining practices right within the Americas. And we know, right, from all of his extensive writings on the Americas that formed only a tiny part of then what he actually went on to look at. So I'd love if you could remind me of what your initial question was, because that's just kind of my initial thoughts on that bit. But he was extremely important, kind of picking up what Ricardo was saying too. He was extremely important to 19th century independence movements. His writings were extremely influential also to enlightened writers in the Americas. When I say the Americas, I mean the Spanish Americas, so the remit of my research. But also to Romantic writers as well of the mid-19th century. Romanticism hits Latin America later than it does in Europe. But he was extremely important to those successive generations of writers. His journeys to Chimborazo, the first European person to like climb it, then became the basis of Bolivar's poem Delirium on the Chimborazo, which is a hemispheric also call to unity, right? So he has all of these traces with extremely key and important independence figures in the 19th century in Latin America. And that was that.
Go ahead, Laura.
So this is a really important and interesting angle in terms of his sort of uptake in the United States. So he comes from Mexico, more or less directly to Washington, D.C., where he meets Thomas Jefferson. And so he's got all this data with him. He's got the most accurate maps for generations. His maps were the most accurate maps of basically the Kingdom of New Spain or Mexico down through central South America. And field knowledge, ground knowledge, and he'd done the study of the economy, of the political economies of Mexico, of Venezuela, of Cuba, detailed. So he comes to Thomas Jefferson with this fabulously detailed knowledge of right on the United States border of lands that the U.S. Americans did not have any knowledge about. So of course he opens this knowledge. Humboldt's idea was that knowledge, why wouldn't you share it? Of course. I mean, just because he was funded by the King and Queen of Spain didn't mean that this was proprietary knowledge, right? So he shares this knowledge with Thomas Jefferson and Gallatin and the Jefferson administration, and starts to open to them an understanding of what was south of the Mexican border, which, his thinking, of course, is that Jefferson is the great apostle of freedom, the great revolutionary president, part of the American Revolution, that would not the United States then support all the revolutions for freedom of all the other American nations, right? What then happened, of course, was in 1845, America, the United States, starts a war with Mexico in order to conquer. They ended up claiming through treaty the northern half of Mexico, going to war with our neighboring independent state, the United States of Mexico, which horrified it. I mean, Humboldt had this loyalty to the United States, but more it was a loyalty to a kind of ideal of what global democracy should look like. And it did not include invading your neighbor and conquering them, reducing them to where to survive they would have to surrender 50% of their historical territory, which is exactly what the United States did. So Humboldt is torn apart by this. Did he have any part to play in this? Divided sense of divided loyalties, a betrayal by the United States, especially because the United States did this in order to expand slavery. to expand slave power in the South. So Humboldt's sense of betrayal by American politics, that universal democratic ideals that he stood for were being betrayed by American politics, made his later life, his relationships with Americans, complicated.
Well, I wanted to ask you one regarding the South American travels. What was his most important scientific discovery? Was it naming species? Was it determining rainfall amounts, that kind of thing? And specifically regarding the Americas as a whole, we talked about his influence with the government heads. But how is he viewed by Native Americans, both in Latin America and here in the U.S.? How much did he study of them? And did he have the then mindset of the noble savage or whatnot, or was he more progressive in that as well?
Well, he was more progressive in that, and this is not my area of expertise, but what I have from reading him deeply and from trying to understand some of the complexities around this. He approached the various indigenous peoples. First of all, he needed them. He was literally moving through their lands in absolutely territory that was unknown or only vaguely known, perhaps to some missionaries, for instance. And he could not go anywhere without native guides. So the first thing he does, he hasn't even stepped on land when he's met by an indigenous person. The canoe comes out to meet the boat. Canoe goes back to land with, I think his name is Carlos Del Pino, if I'm remembering. He goes back to land with this indigenous individual who becomes his guide for the entire voyage. I mean, for the entire time that he's in South America, this man becomes his guide and friend. And so this is just the initial entering wedge, right? That you cannot do what Humboldt did without good relations with the peoples whose lands you're moving through. And he was asking very intelligent and interesting questions in collecting the languages. So one of the things he did was to try to get vocabulary lists and to understand the the great linguistic diversity in the Amazon, which, as far as he could tell, they were extremely complex and sophisticated languages. So he's sending this data to his brother, who's developing a kind of philosophy of language. And Wilhelm determines, and the people around the German intellectual circles are looking at the data that Alexander is beginning to gather and eventually concluding that, in fact, these were immensely sophisticated, not primitive languages in any sense, which blew apart the whole notion of sort of the evolution of civilization and language, right? So that you go back to Indians and you would find them speaking a kind of baby talk. I mean, that just blew that out of the water. No, there was no trace anywhere of a primitive language. So what does that say? So you could say, discovering the interconnectedness of all humanity was a great discovery, but also that every human population, every race, if you will, on this planet is equally sophisticated. There is no white race that's sort of the overlords of the primitive races. That just blew that out of the water.
Yeah, that's
that was one of his most important discoveries. There was another one, which, if you want to, I can hold on to that.
Let me just make one comment, and then you can go on about that. It's like when we talk about Native Americans here in the U.S., and we all use the Americanized version of the name. Instead of Tatanka, Yotanka, it's, Sitting Bull or this one. When, like my name, Daniel Schneider, Daniel means wrathful judgment of God, Taylor, that's a bit of the kind of social demeaning just with the use of language. But go ahead, Laura, about what you were going to do.
Well, so he's looking at the distribution of peoples across the land and working with the peoples as he's moving himself across the land. They're showing him where the plants are and where the animals are and how they live and the capabilities of the ecologies of their different landscapes. And while he's doing this, he's also, of course, observing and collecting plants, and he's climbing mountains, including the famous Chimborazo climb. So the other sort of single most famous discovery, and this was something that 19th century Americans just loved, was to realize as he ascended from the equatorial or equatorial tropics to the highest reaches of Mount Chimborazo, that he was also in effect going from the equator to the poles, right? So that you could understand the dynamics of Earth as a planet from the equator up through the temperate zones to the ice caps by walking up Chimborazo from the equatorial base in the tropics up to the alpine heights. And so he did a very, very famous image, it's quite beautiful, of Chimborazo, showing it belted with all the plant associations from the jungle to the alpine, with columns of data on each side correlating elevation to ecological associations, which included human beings, which he tried to correlate to all the physical factors, like why in the temperate zone do you find just this sort of ecological distribution of plants and animals? So, what is it exactly? So he's trying to identify all the different elements: temperature, air pressure, humidity, and so on, rainfall, climate. This is a kind of global ecological view of the planet, thinking like a mountain, thinking like a planet, starting to interrelate global distribution of species of all kinds with the understanding that they are always moving, right? They are always changing. So people move, they bring with them their plants, their animals. So there was this sort of migration that, plants are always moving, plant populations are shifting. You could see this because he was he knew the geological record. He knew very well that there were dinosaurs and that plants had changed radically through millions of years. So he had a time depth to all this.
Yeah, it was
changing ecologically interrelated Earth.
To sort of paraphrase a wrong scientific apothegm, he sort of discovered that altitude recapitulates latitude in a sense.
Yeah, and like I say, that was such a vivid image. It was reproduced endlessly and sort of mocked up, I started collecting American literary authors who are fascinated by this image of the belted climates, because you could just look at a mountain, you could see them.
So,
but anyway, this larger vision, planetary vision of Earth and the distribution of peoples and species, and oh, by the way, he understood that global warming would happen. He just didn't think we'd burn all that coal. But he understood the dynamics of it. So it wasn't his lack of imagination. He just thought better of us.
What Laura was saying as well, really quickly. Really fascinating point you brought up as well, Laura, because I think in particular, as concerns Humboldt, and also as, like I mentioned before, his influence on literary figures in the Americas, he's so often seen in conjunction with other writers that really denaturalize landscapes, dehumanize landscapes as well. And one of the things that we were kind of dialoguing with in the book that me and Ricardo collaborated on was Mary Louise Pratt's idea of the seeing man, right? And the power of the gaze over landscape, which is a very real concept within 18th and 19th century kind of landscape paintings and naturalist works as well, and views of landscapes. And this idea, right, is that by looking over, by capturing through the gaze, you're also ridding the landscape you're seeing of activity as well, and human activity right within that. And then this also intersects with ideas on indigeneity, on blackness as well. And one of the things that I think is probably underestimated about Humboldt's work is exactly what Laura was talking about, is the interconnectedness of these systems, the repopulation, in a sense, of the landscapes that he was moving through as well, with plants, with what we call in environmental studies, right, the human and non-human others too, and webs of those entities together. What's interesting about I for some reason recently have gotten a real thing also about vertical or verticality, right, of the spaces, kind of as opposed to horizontal spaces too, is it really important to see Americas when we consider one of the central 19th century binaries of civilization and barbarity. It is always conceived of as a horizontal binary, right? That extends throughout, whether it's the plains, whether it's the rainforests, whether it, whatever uncultivated versus cultivated land. But at the beginning of the 19th century, because also of Humboldt's work on vertical climes, it becomes a vertical paradigm too, and binary, where the verticality, right, of the mountains is opposed and contrasted to the depths of the rainforest. And so there's a very famous New Grenadine naturalist called Jose de Caldas, who writes a volume called On the Influence of Climate. And he was supposed to meet up with Humboldt and have kind of in-person conversations with him about the construction of an isthmus, because that was part of what Humboldt was trying to, or supposed to be doing on his work on New Spain anyway. But Jose de Caldas essentially racialized the verticality of the landscape by locating European culture at the mountain's peak, right? And locating violence and the raciality of landscape through blackness, indigeneity, and the depths of those stagnant, humid rainforests as well, and saying that they cause violence, etc., etc. But one of the things about the colder climates was this idea that you could revegetate the site with wheat, because wheat was the ultimate sign of European civilization. And so it had this idea to devegetate rainforests. And a scholar called Felipe Martinez Pinzon has called them deforestation fantasies, this idea that you could completely rid the area of the rainforest and therefore change the climate to reflect the colder climate of the mountain peak. And so there's this really interesting verticality and kind of these proposed devegetation projects that never actually materialized, obviously, but was still very much there in terms of the relationship between the environment. And Humboldt was very much not thinking in these terms, but his work was very much used and kind of appropriated in these ways also to think about the ways in which environment could be controlled, to forward politics, or also forward racial politics, economic, etc., etc. And so there's a really interesting connection there too.
Ricardo, I wanted to ask you, came to me as you were talking a bit earlier about his travels through South America. At around the same time, there was the Lewis and Clark, expedition here in America, and it seems interesting to me that, despite what people say, seemed to be mostly an economic expedition, looking for financial gain, whereas this was not really the same with Humboldt. Did Humboldt ever meet Lewis and Clark, and what did he think of their expedition?
Laura was nodding her head. Sorry.
I've written about this, so
okay.
So I'll take it back to Ricardo.
Okay.
Lewis and Clark, by the time Humboldt met Jefferson, Lewis and Clark were already on their way. So Humboldt had no influence at all on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And of course, he looked for the results because he wanted the results of any expedition anywhere, but was disappointed that they did not, in fact, produce the kind of robust, sort of natural, the kind of Humboldtian work where you would have an interdisciplinary team who would, Humboldt, of course, being like all these disciplines in one. He traveled with Aimé Bonpland, who was a botanist too. He said nothing about his traveling companion, who is a lot, the one who's identifying plants and doing so much of the deep work in the botanical studies. Anyway, that you would have an interdisciplinary team. So you'd have your person with indigenous languages and cultures. You would have another person, an anthropologist in today's terms. You would have your geologist, your botanist. You would have, just go on and think of all the specialties. And so after, so Humboldt's talking to Jefferson and people around Jefferson about how to do the proper scientific expedition. And these recommendations then became the model for all the scientific expeditions that Americans funded for a period of some decades. So Lewis and Clark missed the boat in terms of Humboldt, but the very inadequacies of the Lewis and Clark expedition became, here's how we will do better.
Yeah.
And from that point
I
forward,
just wondered because they seem to be anathema. This was a pecuniary expedition by Lewis and Clark, I would think, in his mind.
Well, I think, I've never really sort of gotten into the Lewis and Clark thing, but yeah, they were out to figure out, doing the best they could to figure out what the heck is out there. I mean, there's just total ignorance. So they're doing their pioneering thing, right? And of course, they've been treated as heroes, as in terms of the kind of values of what Humboldt represents and enacted. Lewis and Clark would not really cut the. I mean, it's a fascinating episode, but it's not a Humboldtian episode.
So, Ricardo, let me ask you then. Since we don't have infinite time, I want to talk about those years between the major South American expedition and his journeys into Russia and Siberia. In that 20+ year period, what was he doing other than being sort of the I guess professional savant?
That's actually a pretty cool question. When I was writing my chapter about him, I ended up looking at a bunch of biographies of him, especially from his contemporaries, right? So, for anybody who wants to know more, Andrea Wolf has a pretty famous biography that is fairly recent. It has come into some scrutiny, but I still find it quite illuminating. But the interesting thing is that his contemporaries will also record what he was doing and what he was saying and what he was publishing, because it didn't take him long to become really famous, right? And so he was living in Paris most of the time, right? He used those years mainly to publish, right? In terms of like his academic endeavor, let's say. He published over 30 volumes of his annotations, observations, works, etc. Right? So he was extremely prolific during that time, right? It is well reported that he used basically all of the family fortune to publish, right? Like whatever was left from his travels, he used it to kind of like share the things that he had discovered with the people around him and the scientific community around him. The other thing is that his contemporaries have all of these different ways of using euphemisms for what he was doing socially, right? Because some people would say like, oh, he would take on like a young male student, and he would be a mentor to that young male student for years, and then that student would go to live with Humboldt, and it's kind of like this meme that my students share with me, that historians always say like, oh, and they were roommates, right? When they mean, they were lovers, right? And so he kept corresponding with a lot of people, both in Europe and the Americas, right? Like he kept on a friendship with Jefferson throughout his life. So, he was well connected. He was a bit of a celebrity, right? But then in his personal life, he never married, and he had a series of what we now would call boyfriends, that he would consort with when he was living in Paris.
Yeah. He also, in terms of sort of scientific work, one of the big projects that in those years was to establish the nature and extent of Earth's geomagnetic field. So to do this meant setting up a bunch of observation stations around the world. So this means a kind of writing to all these people around the world and getting governments to fund. U.S. wouldn't fund one, so it's up in Toronto, the one for our part of the world, which is an interesting story in itself. But he had these visions of international global science, right? So you'd have these satellite stations everywhere. People would then pool their results and observations so that we could start to consolidate information about global systems, weather stations, right? And so that geomagnetic work was one of the first big, the first big international science. And so Humboldt's behind that, but he also starts the concept of the International Scientific Conference, right? Nobody can know everything, so you just bring everybody who knows something together in a room at the same time, right? You start sharing information, right? I mean, we live and breathe this now, but this was one of Humboldt's big, sort of taking this basic concept and really revving it up and turning it into a kind of global, let's all connect and pool our knowledge, which is how he wrote Cosmos, this immense 5-volume, was just pooling knowledge from all these correspondence and these.
And was Cosmos published in these years in between?
Sorry?
Was Cosmos published in the years in between South America and the Russian?
No, it started publication in 1845.
Okay.
He did. Ricardo's absolutely right. He spent himself into poverty. And then the King of Prussia is able to say, hey, buddy, you've got to come back to, was it Prussia? Germany, anyway. The ruler had said, you have to come back and give back to your the homeland now, forced him to return to Berlin for a pension, basically. But he had no money left, so he had to go and return to Berlin. But he would unquestionably have stayed in Paris and lived, as Ricardo was saying, lived as a gay Parisian intellectual for the rest of his life, but he didn't have the funds to keep that up.
I'd like to add to what Laura is saying, that in addition to doing that, society and conference work in person in Paris and in Europe, he also did it at the international level. And I'll give an example of that. That is, it's a bit of a head scratcher. Okay, so Humboldt was actually pretty important for the foundation of the Indiana Agricultural Society, right? And one might think, what does Humboldt have to do with that, right? But that's the thing. He was so invested in bringing societies of scholars together and sharing information and knowledge among them, that even when he was still working in Europe, he was keeping tabs and keeping correspondence with people as far from him as Indiana, right? So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
And they would come visit him in Paris or Berlin. So I mean, just scores and scores of Americans have accounts of spending time with Humboldt in one or the other of the great European capitals. And it was very meaningful to them. I mean, this was not casual. He would set this up. This would be the highlight of their European tour, right? So.
Right. I think it's fair to imagine him as a bit of a celebrity, right?
Oh, absolutely. He was, yeah.
So, Niall, I wanted to ask you then about the Siberian or Russian expedition. This was, he had hoped to have been sort of like, I guess, the mirror image of the South American expedition. But from everything I've read, it was plagued by politics. It was plagued by the crossed wires in terms of what needed to be done. And I think Humboldt was not particularly satisfied with it, was he?
That's a really good question. I don't know much about kind of the Siberian expedition, but what I do know about his influence comes from his time with Pushkin, right? They had a meeting in 1829 in St. Petersburg, and they shared a lot of ideals, right, regarding kind of dissent, kind of anti-imperial forces as well, kind of these imperial politics. Serfdom in Russia, and then also abolition in the Americas too. And so I think, at this point in Humboldt's life, he already has the experience, right, of being under one imperial force, one kind of imperial monarchy, and kind kind of not completely going against what the actual monarchy wants him to do in a sense as well. I mean, we think kind of my work with Humboldt in this regard really concerns the construction or the planned construction of a canal that would link the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. And he essentially told the king he couldn't do it. He said, if you want to do it, here's the point at which you could do it, but I wouldn't advise it whatsoever, right? And so, and we'll have we talk more about that too, but throughout Humboldt's work, there is a real resistance to being contained to one political agenda, right? And thinking about the politics of the time in Russia, and thinking about this meeting between him and Pushkin as well. That's kind of the extent to what I'm aware of, but I can't imagine that he would have done very well with any more kind of controlling circumstances.
Yeah.
Wanting to do what he was wanting to achieve as well. So.
Yeah. That Russian expedition, he was forced to travel with this huge entourage of people and in carriages, and they just the mechanics of it was all wrong for him. You know, they controlled who he talked to. They wouldn't allow him to talk to people that hadn't been vetted and approved, and he couldn't go off wildly exploring. He couldn't see a mountain and say, I want to go climb that. You know, forget all of that. It was very, very, very struck. He was a celebrity, and it was a celebrity tour. He got some good results out of it, but yeah.
But he was also getting up there in age by the time he did this. He wasn't the young man of South America.
Yeah, it's a shame. He wanted to travel across what's now the United States, and go up to Alaska and over to Russia. That would have been a much more interesting trip. Couldn't do it.
He was in his 60s when he went to Russia.
Yeah, I think so. I'd have to do the math. But
it was 1829, so he was 60-ish.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah.
So, Ricardo, let me ask you about then after the Siberian stuff. As Laura had mentioned, Cosmos was published. How is this viewed? Was this viewed as a magnum opus? Was this looked upon it with the same, I guess, I won't say reverence, but the import of later with Darwin and the Origin of Species? What was the impact?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's no question, right? Like Cosmos was the history of everything, right? Like it was just the story of everything that has happened, of the whole universe, right? Like of the world as like this magnetic thing, right? It was a super exciting, mature work as well, right? Because his earlier writing is a bit more dry, I would say. I've read the report about New Spain, which he wrote when he was in his 30s, right? After he came back from visiting the Americas. And it is very much an observation, right? There are chapters, for example, about the mining work in what is now Mexico, what was then New Spain. And they're full of numbers and statistics and just very dry stuff, right? And then Cosmos is much more a reflection of him as a person, right? Where he's still making the observations and he's still talking about how he has been able to kind of like measure the world. But his personality shines through in a very different way. I think in large part is because he has like that maturity and that almost like carefree attitude where he can just say whatever he wants, and he's not necessarily printing or communicating this knowledge because he thinks that scientists around him need the numbers, but rather because he now believes that his perspective of the world really matters. Yeah, that's how I would characterize the later work as opposed to the earlier. Earlier is more scientific, more dry, more about measurement, and then the later work is much more about his perspective and how he understands the world, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Niall, we touched on it when we opened the show about the influence that he had, but what specific scientists went upon his death, which was I think in 1859. Uh, he was certainly famous, but what two or three scientists do you think were most influenced by him, either in terms of the specifics of their sciences or in their approach? Was there anyone else who had this sort of, I guess we'd call it, Catholic approach, small C Catholic?
It's a great question. I want to actually, Laura, I think you had a comment maybe that you wanted to make.
Oh,
Yeah, related to Ricardo's thing.
Okay, go ahead.
sure, yeah. I would not want to leave out his pot. So there was a book of his, I mean, he was his personal narrative, which is, he never finished it, but that is, of course, one popular book that is not at all dry. It has a few dry passages, yeah, but for the most part, it's a fascinating telling of his experiences. And then he pulled together what ended up in the third edition being 7 essays in a book called Ansichten der Natur, which in English is translated as Views or Aspects of Nature, which was phenomenally popular. And these are popular essays. I bring that up because he called it his favorite book. I call it a pocket cosmos, because instead of trying to embrace all the cosmos and everything in between, it's like 7 little experiential pieces, which are kind of like a prism. He uses them to as points from which he can connect out into the universe and the controversies about scientific knowledge and so forth. But whether or not you read all that, which is in the annotations, the essays themselves are quite lovely. And the first one, Steppes and Deserts, I mentioned, was the one that just hit me, and I just, because the poetry of it, it's just stunning. So he could write beautifully, and often did, but then he felt constrained by the forms of professional science to do these dry statistical analyses. And then in Cosmos, just pull out all the stops. It's going to be his great vision. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great point. It's just to tack onto that too. Whenever I'm teaching Humboldt to students, I always have to, get them to say to them, you can get past these sections, even in the scientific measurements, right? There is so much to be like dissected into really kind of meaty comments that he leaves in between measurements, right? To completely expected, yeah.
He's extraordinarily rich, and I and Steve Jackson are working with the same translator on Cosmos right now. We don't yet have an English Cosmos. It's the Victorian translations. Yeah. We need a 21st century Cosmos so we can tell what he's actually saying, and it's quite stunning.
To just kind of go back to your question, and then as well.
Yeah, go back. There was a question.
Yeah. Honestly, it's really interesting to see, for me, in Latin American context at least, the influence that his writings and even just his practice has on late 19th century naturalists as well. You obviously have, as I mentioned before, the early 19th century kind of spate of naturalists that were around at the same time. So like Mutis, Ceci Moutinho, and then also Jose Gales, all in various different parts. So Mutis and then Gales were all in kind of Granada. But he very much influenced them, influenced their writings. Celestino Mutis, for example, then became a huge proponent of Grenadine independence, and there's a really it's an image that the Royal Botanical Gardens in Madrid has. I've not seen it published anywhere else, but it is a partially it's a bust of Celestino Mutis with vines growing across it. But it was published around the time of independence. And so the importance these naturalists had, because they were also documenting the environment and documenting nature, not only as a resource but and commodity, but as products and as cultural inheritance as well. And for me, that's one of the things we consider the late 19th century Latin American naturalists. Costa Rica, for example, has a really interesting case where people, in order to go against what had been done in the area by French naturalists, so documenting plants and then taking knowledge away, they produced a whole herbaria about Costa Rican flora and fauna that was to stay within Costa Rica as well. And so for me, that is part of his inheritance as practice, right, within Latin America, was producing knowledge that was specifically for a national context, not necessarily an international context where this is very kind of privileged information, but really viewing the environment not just as commodity, but also as part of a national legacy, right, as well, that was to be protected in some way, shape, or form. Although contested, right, if we think about the kind of mid 20th century and later neoliberalists and kind of revitalization of monoculture, bananas, etc., within those regions too, with a caveat. However, within like the 19th century, I think his legacy is very important to the naturalist scientists of the area.
So I wanted to ask each of the three of you for your opinions on his not just his death, but his sort of slow fade from prominence in the minds of the public, and what has brought it up again. In an odd sense, it reminds me very much of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, how that, I mean, it didn't have the initial success that Humboldt had in his life, but it faded in it for about 80 years until about the Great Depression, or maybe it was a little bit earlier, at the centenary of Melville's birth, that it started gaining reputation. So let me go around the horn. Laura, let me start with you. What about society in the late 19th century, post his death, contributed to his sort of decline in reputation amongst the laity, at least, and what has precipitated its re-rise?
I'll give it kind of double jointed. First of all, we mentioned early on that he inspired Charles Darwin's Beagle to join the Beagle voyage, and then so Darwin, of course, read everything of Humboldt's, and they met. So Darwin would be the single obvious scientist who would be deeply influenced by Humboldt. I mean, that's the beginning of it. As I said, I was taking a seminar in Darwin, and my professor saying, you can't understand Darwin until you know something about Humboldt. So Darwin then overshadows Humboldt. I mean, in terms of the person who, like, constructs an ecological view of the interrelationship between humans and nature, and puts it on the temporal scale of the theory of evolution, and on and on. The magnitude of Darwin's work becomes that kind of signature voice and leader that everybody then identifies Darwin as kind of the scientist who then overshadows, even though much of Darwin is just moved over and adopted from Humboldt. And if Humboldt had only, he had his finger on a theory of natural selection and backed off. I couldn't believe it. If Humboldt had, it was a different philosophical orientation.
Wasn't Humboldt more holistic whereas Darwin was more focused?
Yes, and that's the other thing, is that focus that Darwin had was typical of Darwin's era. So Darwin, the younger man, becomes much more the sort of guiding, leading, iconic scientist of the later 19th century. And so you get the sense of, as we spoke earlier before, of the specialization and the various fragmentation of the sciences, and the kind of two cultures pull, the sciences and the humanities drawing apart in kind of mutual distrust. And all of this just tore Humboldt apart. You get, Humboldt's politics became very unpopular, and even, something to be suppressed because they were radical and they were dangerous. His environmental views were not at all something that, they could be celebrated and honored in the work of somebody like, well, Thoreau, uh, um, John Muir, but it becomes like a little spin-off into nature writing or maybe exploration, when again Humboldt's view was so much bigger. Um, I think we had to go through a period of exploration of all the potentialities of all these different specialized sciences. And what I think part of the drive now is that we all have, I think all of us in this conference here have been lured into the rhetoric of interdisciplinarity, right? Which is incredibly hard to do, especially institutionally. I was up against that barrier all my career. But Humboldt did it, and so the question is, can he be a model for us? And I think he can, because his results were robust and rigorous and scientifically reliable, right? And so you've got real science happening here, but it's real science grounded in a kind of humanistic vision and profoundly interdisciplinary, not sort of added on, right? But I mean, from the ground up, interconnected interdisciplinarity. So I think he's undergoing a bit of a renaissance now, starting at least 20 years ago. And I do hope it continues, because the vision he offers is one that resonates deeply with what we need. And it is that vision of a kind of we'll call it holistic, but it's empirically, deeply, profoundly engaged with specificities of location and place and human situations, which then get interconnected into a broader vision of a very much sort of mesh-like interconnected, mutually, reciprocally interdependent world.
Ricardo, do you think that the sort of Gilded Age of the late 19th century America was at a time that was sort of anathema to Humboldtism? This was, you shall not crucify me on a cross of gold kind of thing. But that was being killed by the Carnegies and whatnot, and the Rockefellers and all of these barons that saw the world as theirs to plunder.
Well, let me start by saying that I love the Moby Dick comparison, because I mean Moby Dick is one of my very favorite books. It is also very queer, as Humboldt was, right? Like, I mean, if you consider Quickegg and Ishmael marrying and all of that stuff.
Well, also the little boy Pip and Ahab.
No comment. And so it's really interesting, right? Like that Moby Dick kind of like goes out of the common imagination and then comes back, right? It's also, Moby Dick also has like all of these parts that are so, I mean, honestly boring, right? Like where Ishmael goes on and on and on about the whale and like how like the anatomy of whales and like the history of whaling, and you're just like, oh my God, can we get back to the plot, please? Right. So it kind of makes sense to me in a way that Humboldt, in his own right, was kind of like perceived as this like boring writer, I guess, for a long time. And now like we're kind of like rediscovering and refocusing what he actually did, which was really fun, right? Like, and it's actually really fun to read. And as Laura was saying, right? Like, I mean, if the only translation of Cosmos is from like this Victorian English, and I mean, who's gonna read that, right? Yeah. But I mean, other than us nerds, right? But it's just that it's not accessible, I guess, right? In the way that I think Moby Dick was also kind of like not accessible, right? Until it kind of like became in a way. The reason I think that Humboldt kind of like disappeared from like the American mind for a while and is now coming back is that even though he was very influential and like you just need to look at a map of the Midwest to see how many counties and cities and parks and just things are called Humboldt for Alexander, right? To see how influential he was. I think the reason is that he didn't go along with the American project of expansionism and of manifest destiny in the way that people would have liked him to, right? He was always very critical of it, and in the same way that he was an abolitionist, he was also very critical of overexploiting natural resources, which is very contrary to like the way that we imagine like the American expansion of industry, especially in the early 1900s, right, as something that should be celebrated without question, right? And Humboldt was always questioning. He always said, well, is that the right way to do things? And he very explicitly said no, right? Like it's immoral, right? And in the same way that he was an abolitionist, he was also, beyond being an abolitionist, and I think that's really important to say, he was, as I said in the beginning, anti-racist in many ways in which we understand anti-racism in the contemporary sense, i.e., he very much celebrated like the freedom of the human spirit, regardless of what body the spirit is in, right? And to be that way in the 1800s, like to be a European saying that in the 1800s, it's for me at least, it's really mind blowing, right? Like that such a person could exist, right? And that's, at least for me, why I admire him so much, right? Because without any context of, oh, racism might be bad actually, guys, like colonialism might not be the best thing ever, right? He kind of like figured it out on his own. And to me, that's just really wonderful, right?
So, Niall, let me ask you, and since I did so well with the Moby Dick reference, let me stick with literature. There was an American poet in the early 20th century named Robinson Jeffers. He actually was one of the few poets that was ever on the cover of Time magazine. And he wrote very much about nature. He talked about rocks and hawks. And he's considered now a very naturalistic poet. But because of his views on World War II, his reputation was in the tank for 50 years. But the thing that sort of resurrected him in the mind of people who know poetry was global warming. They look at some of his poems as being precursors to the kind of mindset that people should have had. In a similar way, I'm wondering if global warming in the last 20-some years of this sort of renaissance that Laura mentioned, how has do you think that's contributed to people's interest in Humboldt?
Yeah, I that's a really great phrasing of that question too, and I think it definitely blends really well with what I was thinking. To pull on another literary reference for this too, the Quixote, for example, one of the world's best-selling books, was also not famous and not popular when it was published in 1605, right? As the first part of it, and it only became famous and popular hundreds of years later, right? And part of that was also through romanticism in Spain and this kind of finding again of what it is to be Spanish. This was also a German thing with German influence in Spain too. So what I think is interesting with this, right, and kind of really picking up on what Laura was saying before with this idea of in context, specificity of understanding how everything is in context, but also interrelated with this idea of our contemporary period of the Anthropocene / Holocene, right, is really how we are understanding ourselves as humans, as human actors in relation with non-human others, in relation with our environment, and this fundamental questioning of who we are in our own context. I think the conversations that we've been able to have academically, societally, right, over the past 50 years and the increasing presence of the environment, the popularity of environmental studies right now too, the conversations that include post-coloniality and thinking about how everything is interconnected on a global scale, but what that then means also for a regional context. It's kind of all maybe too esoteric, but I think the period that we're in now is fully prepared us, to revisit figures such as Humboldt, to understand essentially what were people who came hundreds of years before us, who had these ideas that really were dialogue so extremely well with what we now in contemporary culture only just beginning to read in literature, see kind of represented in other cultural products as well, to really just answer that question of who we are as people. And for me, I think that's probably why now, not only just because of those really milestone anniversary birthdays as well, kind of really do propel people into the spotlight. It's all those conversations around the fact that it's just was just the 500th anniversary of Spanish colonialism, in 1992, 500th anniversary of Cervantes as well. All of these other major events, and then these other figures who also who enrich our understanding of them through language which we fully understand now, from our contemporary perspective. Not only thinking about global warming, thinking about naturalist writing, thinking about our relationship to environment, but also thinking about our relationship to each other and to these other kind of more global models that unite us as well. And I think that is probably also why he's potentially experiencing a resurgence. I mean, the amount of Humboldtian figures and contemporary cultural product, I think, is fascinating, and just the reworkings of them in ways which do not differ all that much from what Humboldt's primary goal was, which I think also speaks to his texts, his writings, to his life mission as well.
I believe Don Quixote is 400, not 500. I think it was 1600, the 1600s, wasn't it?
It was 1605. I was talking about Cervantes' death. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And so I want to just end it. You gave some pretty good final thoughts before I go to Ricardo and then Laura. Is there anything that has not been said about Humboldt that you just want to get in before we end?
I think for anyone curious, he really is everywhere, and as someone who in grad school, when I encountered him, I really did so naively because of the fact that his name just kept on coming up when thinking about environment in the late 18th and 19th century, and me arriving at a point where I thought I can no longer ignore this. I have to follow this lead and see where it goes. I think for anyone on the fence or really think about diving deeper into what Humboldt did and his writings in particular, they were transformative for me as an academic. They were transformative, I think, for me personally too, in thinking about all these systems in new ways. And so I think that if you are on the fence about looking him up or learning more about him, way past what we've been able to say, which is just a fragment, I just encourage you to do so, because he is surprisingly transformative.
Ricardo, any final thoughts from you, or anything that has been missed that you want to add?
Well, I just want to say thanks for having me here, this was super fun. And I hope we were able to convey how cool Alex is. And look him up. He was just like this really extraordinary adventurer, empathetic, wise beyond his century guy, And we still have much to learn about him, I think, So if I was able to, inspire a little bit of research, even if it is just looking at the Wikipedia page, I'm really happy. And yeah, I just want to say thanks for having me here.
Same with you, Laura. Any final thoughts or anything we've missed about Big Al?
Yeah, I'll say. So 15 years ago, I published my own book on Humboldt. I titled it "Passage to Cosmos," and it's about the importance of Humboldt in American life and U.S. American life and culture by an English professor who had to take 10 years to go write a book about a German scientist, right? Paradoxes of life. But I was so attracted and so compelled by Humboldt's vision, and the name that he gave it was Cosmos. And so this is the capstone book, a series of books really, and the name Cosmos for it is a kind of key to his why his thinking can be so attractive to us. So in the Anthropocene, we've got this sense of division, right? We are violating the nature of the planet in such a fundamental way that there's a sense that we are wrong for the planet. We are divided from the planet. We're alienated from the surge of life across Earth. And Humboldt's Cosmos is about well, put it this way. He writes about the physical universe, and he's quite explicit about the universe it's been going on for, he doesn't have the time scale we do, but we would now say billions of years before us and will go on billions of years after us. So that's not in question. But he calls it cosmos because this is the ancient Greek term for beauty and order, right? For a composed, a universe composed into beauty and order. And so Humboldt's vision of cosmos is not a kind of physical universe that we have violated. It is a cosmos that we are co-constituents. We are co-creators of the beauty and the order of this cosmos, right? So it's an ancient Greek term that he's reintroduced into modern discourse. And that is something that tells us that the cosmos needs us. If you really get on board with this concept, you don't get to say, I mean, Robinson Jefferson is capable of saying, it would be good if we just all disappeared, all of us. And I can have moods like that. Humboldt never thinks like that. As much as he can mourn human evil and what we've done and will do to the planet, he wants us to be part of the cosmos. As he wants humanity to be the integral part of the cosmos, because we are that part of the cosmos that can turn and self-examine what the cosmos is and what it is capable of becoming. And so at a time of the Anthropocene, when we feel this sense of division and defeat and paralysis and a kind of, I think nature is a harder place to go to than it used to be because of what it's doing. Back, the revenge of nature, as Lovelock told us. Humboldt's cosmos is a vision of our planet, of our capabilities as human beings, that's not shadowed by the Anthropocene, that comes out of a time before. It feels so contemporary, but it's missing that pain, that sense of the kind of destructiveness that we feel that we're bringing to the planet. And to read Humboldt and to realize that there is another path, right? That we could have and yet perhaps could still redirect ourselves down a path as beings of the Anthropocene still, but maybe we're wiser now. Maybe we're even wise enough now because we have discovered ourselves in the Anthropocene. Maybe now we are actually wise enough to get about the business that Humboldt tried to give us of composing a good cosmos and being part of the composition of something that will last.
Well, Cosmos as opposed to Chaos, and I'd have a different website name if it wasn't for Humboldt. So I want to thank all three of you, Laura, Ricardo, and Niall, for talking about Alexander von Humboldt. Thank you.
Thank you for creating the occasion.
Yeah, it was really. Thank you.